This watercolor tutorial called Cold Water Refuge kind of leads past last week's lesson on doing trees properly. So this is just that same type of lesson but with some added water and background. As you can see, the sketch is pretty simple, just your trees. The coloring is also pretty simple. We have indigo blue, cerulean blue, sap green, some yellow ochre. We also are into our browns with some burnt sienna, burnt umber, and black. Your brushes today, you're going to use your big flat brush for bigger areas like the sky. We're also using a number 8 round, a number 4 round, and your rigger and liner. You'll also be using a spoon today to scratch out some trees, and you'll be using salt. When we put the wash on for our water, a nice wash of water first. Mine looks a little blue here because I was preparing my paint. But you want to wet your whole background area. So that would be the area above your tree line all the way to the top of your paper. And I have mine wet pretty well because I'm going to be working that in that area, adding color for a little, for a few minutes. So I don't want it to start to dry on me. I'm using my indigo, nice deep indigo, because I want this sky to look like a winter stormy type of sky. It's very cold. So I'm using a lot of my indigo, nice and watered down though, because I want it to really dissipate on the paper and blend and move about so that I don't get any hard edges. I will be creating hard edges when I start to blot out my clouds, but I don't want hard edges of paint that is coming to a dry section. So I have a lot of water on this sky. Once I get my paint down where I'd like it to be, and you can change up the colors by adding a little bit of cerulean, even a little bit of purple. You want to make sure you wipe off your surface so that you don't get washback. And then you're going to lift your paper so that your paint moves in all directions. Once again, you can add coloring to deepen coloring as long as your paper is still nice and wet. Do not try to do that if your paper starts to dry. Once you get your paint moved around and nice and smooth, I'm just using a Kleenex. I'm using a rolled Kleenex to do that line of white across the tree line. And then I'll start to blot out some of my clouds. I'm going to blot out my clouds in different time sections because I want my paint to start to dry on the surface before I blot some of them. That way, not all of the paint will be lifted because some will have already set in the paper, and I will get different values of clouds. I will add my really dark clouds in later. So you want to blot out some clouds now that'll take you back to your white paper. And then you're going to let that paint sit for 2 or 3 minutes. And you can blot a few more. As the paint sits and dries, it won't take you back to your white paper. It'll take you back to a layer that already has paint set in on it. So you're going to get different values of clouds. If you don't get enough blotted out, don't worry, because we're going to add clouds at the end also, and you'll be able to add in some clouds where you may have wanted one and didn't get it blotted out in time. It will be a darker cloud, but at least you can go ahead in and put in some clouds. You want to be sure to leave some dark areas now. You don't want just total blotted out. We're going to use that same indigo color now, and we're going to go down into the water. So right below those little islands, I'm going to put a line straight across of my indigo from the bottom of that little island to the bottom of my paper. At the edge of my island, I'm going to just use the edge of my flat brush and do a couple little ripple lines, and I'm going to salt that area. Then I'll move over to the center because I'm doing it in sections because I don't want my paint to dry. And if I try to do that whole bottom section, there's a chance that it might start to dry on me. So I'm painting in section at a time and salting it so that I get my salt on in time, because I want my salt to produce the small ripply lines and areas in my water where it's going to look like the sun is glistening off that rippled wind-blown water. So I'm doing this the whole way across. Once my water is completed and salted, I want to get my green, my sap green ready, because I'm going to do that area of grass on the other side of the water behind the trees. So make sure you have your water salted well. If you have puddles of water, wait for those puddles to dissipate before you add your salt. Because if your paper is too wet and too saturated with puddles of water and paint, that salt will just disintegrate in the water and nothing will happen. So the area behind there where the grass is going to be, you're going to be using both your yellow ochre and your sap green and your black mixed with a little bit of umber. The sap green is going to go on that whole grassy area, and I'm splitting it up in between my tree branches, which is a good thing because it'll give me time to work on each of those grassy areas instead, again, of trying to do the whole thing all the way across. So my biggest branches on my trees are helping me to be able to do this picture in sections. I'm doing an oversized picture today, so I'm going to be working in sections, but you can do any size because what you'll be seeing on the video will apply to any size painting. While your sap is wet, I'm dropping in ochre, really wet ochre at the top of my sap, and then at the bottom of my sap, I'm dropping in really wet black mixed with some umber. And I'm allowing that to move within the sap green. The ochre is just going to break up that solid sap color, and the umber and black is going to be the base for my weeds around the water line. That is going to go the whole way across also. Sap, umber and black on the bottom, and ochre on the top. And I'm doing it all while that sap is nice and wet so that it can blend and bleed together. While it's still wet, I'm dropping just a little bit of salt into that, not everywhere. I'm trying to pick out a couple places in my umber and black to show a little bit of crazy texturing in the weeds. If you get it in your sap and you get it in your ochre, it's certainly not going to hurt. It will just add to the texture of your picture. But I'm mainly trying to get it into the umber and the black. Now the paint is still going to be wet, so I'm going along the upper part of my ochre and I'm just dry brushing out the edge so that I don't have a real super smooth edge up there. There's going to be a tree line above that, which I will bring down into the ochre, but I just don't want that straight line of ochre. I kind of want to make that line uneven a little bit. So while it's still wet, just use your round, your number 2 or round, and just break up that solid line. Now after my salt has set in and dried a little bit, I'm removing all of the real loose salt because now I'm going to finish off putting some color in my water. I've watered down my indigo color, and I'm going to paint the rest of the water. That would be from the land line down to the water I already painted. I'm painting that in with a light wash of indigo. And I want that wash to be really light because I want that to look as if the light is already reflecting off of that area of the water. So that's going to be a light wash of indigo. While that is still wet, I will drag through just with my rigger or my number 2 round some more intense indigo. I'm going to do that through the water just to change up that nice plain indigo color. And using my bigger brush, I will use some more intense indigo mixed with a little bit of black to shadow or put reflections in the water where the weeds are. So up against that land, up against the edge of the water, into the water, while it's still wet, I'm using indigo and some black, and I am doing a line along that edge, and I will have that line uneven. So if there's a lot of bushes, I will put a little bit more of that paint. If there's a thinner area of the weeds, I'll have that paint line a little thinner. I don't want just a straight line across. I want there to be some different heights to that. I'm using an envelope to keep the salt from going everywhere. I only want the salt to be in this front section, so I'm using an envelope to keep it from going everywhere. You can use a piece of paper, you can basically use anything. Now I'm going back up here into my sky with plain water. You cannot do this unless your sky is really dry. That means drying it with a hair dryer both on the front and the back, because you don't want to take the chance of lifting the color that you already put down. This is for the tree line. So I'm only wetting up about maybe 3 inches because I don't want my tree line to go all the way to the top of my paper. This is umber and black. I'm putting that color in, and then I'm going to add a little bit of sienna here and there, and I will add a little bit of sap here and there, because again, this is winter, fall is over, so your fall colors, if there's any leaves left on the trees, they're still visible. So that's why I'm adding that little bit of sienna and a little bit of sap. I'll move my picture around, not horizontally, because I don't want my paint to go too far into the sky. I want it to go more left and right. So I'll lift my paper and hold it so that it can run to the right or run to the left. But I don't want it to go too far up into my sky. Allow it to run. You'll get that nice soft edge on the top of your trees, and you're going to use your brush, dry brush it down into your ochre area, because you don't want a straight line across there. It's not, grass that's cut with a mower. You want it to be nice and uneven. And then you want to throw on some salt. Again, I did not salt the entire thing. I picked out just some sections and I salted the tops of the tree line, not everywhere. If it goes down farther, it's fine, but I didn't want my salt to be everywhere. I wanted my salt to be more of a texturing to leaves that might be left on the trees. Now comes your spoon. So have your spoon ready, because after your tree section gets to a matte finish, you want to make sure it's at a matte finish before you try to scrape out any trees. And what I did was I just tried to scrape out a few here and there to look like birch trees in that background. But I also wanted to scrape out the bigger trunks and branches of my trees in the lake, so that I wouldn't have hard lines on those where it met the land. So where your biggest branches and trunks are, I scraped out a couple of those branches up into the sky area. Only where it would continue from what you already have drawn. Now that I know where my trees are going to be, I'm going to take just some straight black. I'm still wet, and I'm going to just drop in some black to give some depth to some of those tree areas. You don't have to do it the whole way across. You can pick some sections, but you want to have some depth to the trees in the background. Now I'm going to start to put some ripple lines in the water that is in the distance. Just dry brushing a few lines from my right side over to my left. You can decide where you'd like those to be or refer to your picture, but you will see how nice those ripple lines will make that lake or pond look. If you haven't put in your reflections up by the edge of the pond, where the water hits the bank, then you can put those in. You're using indigo and black to add in those areas. You want to make sure that you have that reflective area, because those bushes kind of go, they're pretty steep at the edge of that pond, so they're going to be reflective in the water because there's so much light hitting that water that you're going to have those reflections, in the water. You can't not have them because you're having reflections everywhere else. So you have to have those reflections also. It's just your indigo and your black, and you're going right along the pond or the lake edge. Now at this point you want to really dry your paper really well and get off all of the salt, because you don't want salt in your dark clouds in your sky. You can do these at your leisure. They don't have to all be done at one time. I'm doing one at a time, even though in the video it looks as though I'm doing them all together. I'm allowing them to dry. There's time in between, and then I do another one. There's time in between. So it's up to you how you want to do it. You want to wet the area where you're going to do a darker cloud. It can be in a cloud, it can be at the base of a cloud, or it could be overlapping a cloud. You want to wet that area. You want to put in some much darker indigo. I softened the edges with water so that the water would actually be clear all around this dark cloud. And then I'm going to just reblot with a Kleenex. You want to leave, of course, some of that nice dark color in there, but I'm just taking a nice Kleenex and re-blotting. You don't have to re-blot on the exact lines that you blotted before, because these different values of your color is what makes this sky interesting. So you don't have to try to re-blot the exact same spot you blotted before. It can be different. Along your blot line, you can add some additional color if you'd like, and then just allow that to blend and bleed and soften itself. If you want to blot more after a minute or two, you can go back in and blot some more. And you're going to repeat that process anywhere where you want these nice dark clouds to be on your sky. I eventually did a whole line of dark along my tree line so that I would have that real intense dark clouds. I allowed just a little bit of light clouds at my tree line and then went in with a nice dark line of clouds. and it really dramatizes this dark sky. Again, you do not have to do this all at one time. You can take your time and do it when you feel comfortable doing it. You don't want to try to hurry through this. This is something that you cannot hurry, because if you try to hurry it and get too much of it done, then you can't keep an eye on where color might be seeping back in and you have to reblot. So you want to really watch what you're doing so that you can keep an eye on reblotting or re-adding color. Make sure everything is really nice and dry again. And now I'm going to paint in my main trunks and branches on my trees. This is umber with some black, more black than umber. And I'm just painting in my main branches and my main trunk with my bigger brush. Then I will revert to my rigger for some of my smaller branches, and then finally my real fine branches will be done with my little liner. But I want to make sure I get my biggest branches and my trunks where I want those first. Take your time, plan it. If you didn't draw it in now. Because if you make a mistake, it's going to be very hard to fix that mistake, because you're going to have that really dark color over your sky and over your light water. So you want to make sure you know where you want these branches and the tree trunks to be. Take your time, use different brushes so that you get different widths to your tree and your branches. Make the branches go to the left and to the right. They have elbows in them. They are not all just straight lines. Look at your picture. Study that tree so that you get a feeling in your mind of what that looks like before you try to hurry and put all of your branches in. And again, these branches can be added at any time. They can be added tomorrow, they can be added a week from now. If you see an area that you think is lacking some branches, you can always add them. Less is better because you can't take them off. So take your time to do it well. You're going to be doing both trees. Now, after you get all of your nice fine branches in on both trees, we're going to go down and we're going to paint in the islands. They are just going to be done in the same color, black and umber, more black than umber. The islands are thin. It's not a big mound. It's just a thin area of land that is just above the water line. There's going to be weeds and sticks and bushes on those also. The geese will come in later. So on both trees, you're going to be painting in those little mounds of land. Make sure you get those nice and straight. They're not crooked. They're not uneven. It's a straight line, straight across. And you will do both of those also. I did not throw any salt or anything on those, but if that's your preference, it certainly wouldn't hurt to do that. Make sure you use your finest little liner brush to do your weeds growing off that island. You don't want any big thick branches. They're not like trees. They're just bushes that have been winterized, so just your thin sticks and twigs are showing. Same coloring, black mixed with umber. Still not done. Now we're going to go to the other side of the pond and we're going to add all of the sticks and little bushes that are growing at the edge of the water. I dry brushed along the edge a little bit at a time with my smaller brush using that same color, umber and black, more black than umber. And then after I dry brushed and pulled out some of those nice tall pieces of branches, I used my small little liner and made some additional branches here and there. You don't have to do it everywhere. Your dry brushing should be enough at some of the points. But I did want to pull out some branches in some of those areas. At the same time that you're using that umber and black color, you can go up into your field and just lay your brush down horizontally to create some sections of dark, dead grasses and weeds. You don't have to pull them out or make them into anything. I just laid my brush down. You can dry brush vertically if you want to, just to pull it out a little bit, but you don't want to make any big tall things. When you're finished doing the whole other side of the pond, save that color because we're going to go back up into our tree line and actually do the same thing at the tree line. Dry brushing along the edge and making some trees, some visible trees in that tree line. So that will continue on with that same color, that same style of dry brushing and using your real fine liner to pull out some trees. Plan where you want your trees to be. Don't just go across the back putting them everywhere. If you have those nice birch trees, then you're probably not going to want to cover those with other kinds of thin branches. So you want to plan where you want them. Dry brush first, pulling up your darkest color, and then actually paint in a few trunks and some bigger branches. You don't have to do quite as much of the real fine branches because it's so far in the distance. You're not going to see too many of the fine branches. You'll see branches, but you won't be showing as many fine branches. You're doing mainly the bigger branches that shape the tree. And you're going to be doing that the whole way across, again, from right to left, filling it in. Don't make them all the same heights. Have different heights to your trees. That's what will add some interest, to where your background is. It'll draw your eye towards the background also, especially if there's a tree of different height that is going to pull your eye to that area. Now we want to prepare our water for our white highlights. So I'm putting in a dark line of indigo directly in front of my islands, about 2 inches wide, straight across. You can leave a couple little open lines here and there, but you want it basically to be solid from one end of the paper to the other, about 2 inches wide. You can put a few little lines behind your island also if you'd like to, depending on how much water you have back there. Again, depending on how big your islands are and and the construction of your picture. You don't want your darkest lines to be too close to the edge of your pond. This is more in the center of your pond. So you want to have nice dark indigo lines there. You can throw a little bit of salt onto that if you would like to allow that to work. And then you want to drag through some even darker indigo lines through the center of that, just to change up the color so that you don't have a solid color all the way across. Along the edge, I'm just using my brush, almost dry brushing the edge so that I don't have a simple straight line going all the way across. I want it to look like the water is rippled and moving, so I want to have myself a nice uneven line down there. You can do some fine lines behind your island too, but again, depending on how much you have back there, you don't want the lines to go to the edge of the pond. While you're nice and wet still, you want to go ahead and put in your reflections of those trees and those bushes in the water. So I'm using some black, watered down black, and I will be putting those reflections in the water where the tree and the bushes are. So directly below that nice big tree trunk, I'll be doing some black for the reflections in the water. It can be broken lines. It does not have to be a solid line. And I'm going to do the same thing all along the edge of that little island, but most especially make it a little bit thicker where those bushes are. You'll be doing that on both little islands all the way across. You want to make sure that those reflective lines are straight also. You don't want them tilted to the left or to the right, because then your water's going to look uneven. So you want to make sure that your reflections also are straight. They don't have to be solid, but they need to be straight. When you have finished, you want to make sure everything is really dry, and you want to remove all of your salting because you don't want any of that left on your picture now. You're going to be doing your little fine geese. Use your smallest brush, and they are basically a little dot with a neck and a head. These geese are small. They are far in the distance. They can't be the size of your thumbnail. They are small, very small. If you don't think that you can do it with a watercolor brush, use a black watercolor pencil. But you have to make sure that you keep them small. If you make them too big, it's going to ruin your picture. These are just silhouettes of geese far in the distance. Some are still in the water, some are up on that little island. If you think you need to draw them in first, you can. I don't think that's necessary because it's just basically a little black dot with a line for the neck and another dot for the head. Don't overdo it with the geese. There's not 10,000 of them. When you're done with your geese, dry everything well and get prepared for your white. This is where we're going to be doing all of our white reflections in the water. You want to use your white. You want to make sure that it's thick enough because otherwise you'll go to all this work and it'll dry so light that you won't even be able to see it. So my suggestion always is when you are using white and you're using a good bit of it is to prepare your white, do a very small section, allow it to dry so you can see if the intensity that you have mixed is going to be workable. If it dries and you cannot see it, then you need more paint. Don't do the whole thing and then let it dry and realize you can't see it and you have to do it all over again. Know the intensity before you go on. You're going to be dry brushing and you're going to be using your rigger to actually draw long lines and thin ovals to make it look ripply. I purposely put most of my highlighting in the center between those two trees, and then I moved it off to the side just a little bit. Mainly I moved it off to the left side, but that would be something that would be up to you. There are a few little white lines in the middle of the real dark blue, but if you look at your picture, you'll see where you want most of your whites to be. This is very, very simple, just lines, just long loopy lines, and again, less is better. You can always add this white. You can add these white lines a year from now if you want to. But less is better because you cannot take it off. It's hard to take off. So take your time, know where you want it to be. This highlighting really adds to the picture. It makes the picture, especially if your salting didn't work like you wanted it to in the very beginning. Just keep doing nice thin lines. Dry brush with I used my number 2 to dry brush mainly. Make sure your lines are straight. Again, you don't want crooked lines. It will make your water look crooked. Dry everything really well, and you are finished. Even though it's cold, it's a beautiful painting. I hope you enjoyed this one. Next week, I promise, no trees. You've done good. Happy painting.